the question then becomes, if the United States chooses to stop providing ammunition to Ukraine, who's going to come up with the other 1.2 million? And that's before European NATO has restocked its own arsenal with all the munitions it's given away to Ukraine.
Dr. Ford, thank you for being with us to discuss your upcoming book, War in the Smartphone Age, Conflict, Connectivity, and the Crisis at Our Fingertips. And thank you for the audience for listening into our conversation. Dr. Ford, what was your inspiration for writing War in the Smartphone Age?
Fellas, thank you very much for having me. I think the underlying reasons for me approaching this book were a function of studying the war in Ukraine over the last 2 to 3 years. I wrote the book last summer, so I had about 2 years of research, and that research was geared as a result of writing a book with Andrew Hoskins. I'd written a book with Andrew Hoskins published in February 2022, and I'd spent the next 2 years trying to understand how wrong that book was. And so the result of that research effort was War in the Smartphone Age. To my surprise, and a few other people have said this to me as well, the first book I wrote with Andrew, Radical War, was surprisingly on the money in terms of how we might think about war in the 21st century, war in the 2020s. But War in the Smartphone Age was me trying to broaden the appeal and show that how war in a digital context was not just about its representation, but also very much focused on the conduct of war, how the digital mediated the conduct of war. So, and most of the book is my effort to try and show the reader how I explored that, how I went about making sense of the mess that you usually see on your smartphone when you're looking at your social media, and then comparing that with what politicians are saying, what legacy media are saying. So that was that was the impulse, the inspiration for War in the Smartphone Age, to try and document how I went about making sense of what I was looking at, and just to make sure that when I go back to Radical War, there was some sense in it. And I'd like to think, although that's clearly for you guys who've generously read War in the Smartphone Age, but also for others who've read some of the earlier stuff I've done, I'd like to think that people will see that there is there's some sense in what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I think the book it's great. And of course, the topic of civilians and the usage of smartphone and social media in war in 21st century is a very hot topic. I think the book has done a wonderful job. I absolutely enjoy reading it. So I'm going to dive in straight with my questions. You mentioned, civilians becoming sort of an actor in the kill chain by through many different ways. One of that was how they are now contributing data to military operations, knowingly or unknowingly, maybe through apps, social medias, or open source intelligence. So I just want to ask for your opinion, what new ethical or legal dilemmas does this create?
I mean, it's on the one hand, you can say, well, war hasn't changed. It still looks like it's tanks and it's bombs and aircraft and their trenches. I mean, the war in Ukraine is a good example of how some of that kind of works. But at the same time, there's this sort of digital overlay, and that digital overlay affects some parts of war more than others. And so you've got this very mixed information environment, where on the one hand, you're back to the, I hesitate to say, offer a model for a war, but you're back to some kind of war that people might traditionally have thought about in terms of the kinetic effects of bombs and bullets. But at the same time, there is this, the reality is also that the internet hasn't got switched off. Ukraine's a very connected place. There are other parts of the world that are experiencing similar levels of connectivity, similar levels of smartphone distribution. There are 100 odd wars going on around the world. we're focusing on Ukraine, but the same dynamics. Your life is increasingly on your phone. What happens when there's political violence going on? That is a constant. That's now a norm. I think that the internet's not getting switched off. You are going to be in a situation where something war-like, some political violence is going to go off, and you're going to be there with your phone, and you're just going to have to work out how to engage with that. Now that technology is not going away, and trying to work out what that implies when you're just wandering around in a kinetic environment with these technologies and not necessarily familiar with the military challenges, and yet somehow broadcasting something over your phone, that is compromising your position, because if you're taking a picture, you might get shot at. And seeing that happen in Ukraine, and how that shapes the conduct of war in relation to Russians shooting at Ukrainians who might be filming them, that's a practical reality. That might shape how people use their phones. They might be trying to avoid taking pictures, or the internet might be shut off for a moment as someone's trying to manipulate the information environment, but people can still record things and then broadcast them later on. But all of that has some serious implications, not just in terms of the person who's recording the stuff, but there's a whole set of information infrastructures that make all of that possible, to the point where different apps and different applications, smartphone applications, are being repurposed for military use. And that are those people implicated in this problem? Are the Google workers the munition workers of the 21st century? And if they are, what's their combatant status? And what are about all of the bits of the plumbing, the infrastructure, the information infrastructure that joins the user on the smartphone filming something to the broader internet? Where does it stop? Now, if you're a lawyer and you're working on the laws of armed conflict, I think there's probably at least a couple of schools of thought where the law is fairly flexible. It adapts to changing conditions of use, and then there's and it's about setting norms, and but then there's the other circumstance, which is along the lines of the actual way people are fighting, the way people are using these technologies is too much for existing norms. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but that debate, it seems to me, has probably not fully played out yet. And there's going to be a lot of umming and ahhing about whether actually the laws of armed conflict apply in exactly the same way. I mean, I know people who work at the ICRC, and they say, look, if you're a participant, these are the conditions, and that's just the way the law is. And then you'll hear others who are going, well, hold on, in the heat of the moment, that may be illegal, but it's exactly what people are going to shoot at you if you're filming something, right? So when you're downloading an app and you're fighting in you're in a military environment, military context, does the app have a tick box in it that says you understand you might compromise your combatant status, your civilian status, if you use this in a kinetic environment where there are other people, where a war is going on around you? And that sort of disclaimer, do app developers build that into the app as they're asking you to make use of it? And I'm not sort of setting out that I know the answers to some of these questions. I think War in the Smartphone Age was me trying to set out how I understood the challenging problems that digitization, the digital, and war and connectivity are creating for both armed forces and civil society when the internet just doesn't get switched off. And even the idea that the internet gets switched off, that might be people's mental models, but the practical reality is you need the internet to be kept on because your economy is dependent on it, and communications, everything, life is on the internet. Right?
Yeah, you discuss a real ethical dilemma in terms of, on the one hand, these civilians as you were talking, it sort of reminded me of the French resistance in a way, right? So on the one hand, these civilians they're actively, although we can debate how actively, participating in the conflict by using applications such as Evora, which you discuss, to submit, target information, enemy movement to the Ukrainian government as far as the Russians. So on the one hand, you have civilians participating at that level in the conflict, but on the other, like you said, it's not like there is a user agreement when they're downloading and installing these applications that tells them, hey, you may be subject to the Geneva Convention, for example. So can you talk a little bit more about the Evora application and maybe how successful Ukraine has been in receiving information through it?
Yeah, firstly, I think it's important not to overemphasize how it is an important development, I think. And several 100,000 people have used it to take images of Russian columns. Clearly, it works. It's more useful when there are Russians invading and the civilian population is mixed in with the invading force. But as front lines have sedimented and stretched out, and we've got fortifications and trench lines and all the rest of it, the possibility that an ordinary civilian might be able to make use of this technology in order to spot for a Ukrainian military unit and their intelligence fusion cells, that changes, right? That's just a function of how the war has evolved. I'm not trying to suggest that somehow this is it's a mixed information environment, and that just reflects the changing patterns of the conflict. But if you're going to make use of this technology as opposed to WhatsApp or Signal or something else, or any kind of instant messaging platform, the instant messaging platform, you could just dial something into your local artillery officer that's manning artillery unit with the report of a moving column. The problem with that is that it doesn't have standardized information associated with it, and actually you want the kind of the metadata. You want to know the geolocation. You want to know I don't know, the time of the day and all of these other bits and pieces, because the fact that when the picture was taken that unit might have moved on. You need to be able to trace all of that. That might not be the best time to attack that unit, but you need to gather that information. And standardizing the way you collect is kind of really important from a point of view of trying to fuse civilian intelligence, civilian garnered intelligence with all of the other sources of intelligence that might be available to you, whether it's in the satellite signals, any other kind of electronic warfare information, radar impressions, or whatever. So, it's not that necessarily the human stuff is the civilian collective stuff is the most important, but it's going to be fused, and it's an additional source of intelligence, I think. So clearly, that information can be used in order to pick out the most relevant artillery units to engage a particular moving target. So, and that can be planned and, is a useful additional sources of information,
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point about we need to look at civilian intelligence as what it is. We should not underestimate or overestimate it. Both are dangerous. But it definitely sets out a lot of lessons for future conflicts, perhaps, that we have teams or more standardized sets of how we can integrate civilian intelligence into the wider military intelligence network, as well as we have teams and officers that can go and train civilian quickly to make sure that they can assist properly, or we can utilize them in a sort of functioning way that not harming civilians but also makes sense to the military. But also you mentioned
Yes.
you mentioned the information environment.
Yes.
And as far as I'm concerned, most of the environments are not controlled by the governments, but rather are controlled by tech giants.
Yes.
And definitely in the book, you mentioned a lot about the role of these tech giants as a geopolitical actors in wars, taking the power of narrative away from governments and to them. So how should governments, especially the one that we have here in the West, respond to this issue of the rising of tech giants and their role in war?
I think it presents serious problems. Some of the larger social media platforms are in the US, and therefore they're subject to US interventions and regulation. And so if the US doesn't want to regulate, then, it's going to be very difficult to manage, at least in terms of law. There are efforts, clearly. Some European governments are sort of pushing back on the idea that, the social media platforms should manage the types of content that's put on there because it's creating social harm or whatever. Now, but you take that one step forwards into the context of political violence and war, and a whole series of things become harder to work through because the crisis itself shapes what's acceptable and what's not. I think the important thing for a situation like Ukraine is that if you're broadcasting battle damage assessment, if you're broadcasting the effects of Russian attacks, then effectively you're giving intelligence away to the Russians. And the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian general public have worked very hard at restricting how people broadcast stuff subsequent to a drone strike or a missile strike or whatever. And I think, broadly speaking, you don't see that kind of footage on social media because one of the reasons why is that you'll get a visit from the police who will tell you to stop broadcasting that stuff, right? But that requires a sort of information campaign to prepare the population for how to deal with being in a war zone where you have the technology to broadcast information as you like. And so one response is not to intervene at a platform level, but to intervene at a population level. And I think, broadly speaking, that's been reasonably successful. But it kind of depends on the digital literacy of your population, how real all of this is for them, whether they and communicating clearly in a way that makes it clear that they have the means to broadcast, produce, publish, and consume media from one device, and that is revolutionary in so many ways. Right? It has radically democratized people's capacity to share information without having to go through some kind of editorial process. The flip side is at a platform level, we're at the whims a little bit of the people who own these platforms, right? The way in which you might shape or control that discussion, I think, is very, very context dependent. It depends on the political cause or the particular war or the alignment of interests between the platform owner and the politicians and others who are involved in shaping how the war might be perceived and whether it should support one side or another. Taking that all the way down to the battlefield, I don't want to imply somehow that you're reading war live over social media, because you're clearly not. It's just the social media is mediating the war, and it's framing what is being represented and how we might come to understand and make sense of. Actually, how it certainly frames how we understand and make sense of it, insofar as we're presented with a stream of images and a feed that is out of sequence, that has no ordering, and then that pushes the challenge back on us to try and make sense of what's going on. And that's very, very hard when the chronology is not there and everything's out of sequence, and it's not a military history you're reading. You're getting a vibe, and the vibe isn't very good for how to make sense of necessarily what you're seeing. So, and again, that's one of the reasons why I wrote War in the Smartphone Age, is how did I break down that vibe to kind of at least try to make sense of what I was seeing on my social media feed.
Great, Dr. Ford. And also, obviously, the social media landscape, it's less fragmented than it used to be, but it's still pretty fragmented. So for a government to try to be, have the tech companies as interlocutors, it can be complex in terms of policing the level of engagement that they have. But switching gears a little bit, in the beginning of War in the Smartphone Age, you described the media narrative of the Russian invasion and how there were parallels to the invasion of Finland in 1930.
Yeah.
So how do you think, did this lead the West, this narrative and our consumption of it, did it lead the West to underestimate, maybe not so much Russian military capabilities, but the capacity for Russia to pursue this war of attrition, this type of war.
Yeah, I think there was that use of Finland. In my mind, that was a media operation to try and shape the early narratives of the war. But it's sort of taken on a life of its own, and instead of trying to, and it has conditioned us to think that Ukraine is going to win, without reflecting on the more material conditions that shape how wars are fought. So, the war is not going to be won on Twitter or X or any other social media platform. It's going to be won on the battlefield. And the memes of the tanks being towed away by tractors and the javelin and the cats and all these other things, it shaped the information environment and it persuaded the West to put their effort behind Ukraine. But over the last year and a half, 2 years, interest in that war in the West, I think, has dropped off. And it's become something that people would rather ignore, or it's over there, or it's not something, it's just going to carry on. It's going to do what it is going to do. And then it'll come, eventually something will happen. And I think probably that early narrative about the Russo-Finnish war was, in my view, unhelpful. Because it fitted a historical frame, but didn't take us back to the battlefield, and didn't take us back to some of the hard, the more material realities, the harder the material realities of what it is for a country of 44 million to take on a country of 120 odd million, and all of the resources of a country with a continent level strategic depth, and with all due respect to what's going on, it's it's going to be hard to manage that. And that narrative of winning, I think, has sort of led the West into taking its foot off the pedal. Europe needed to rearm in February 2022, and now it's March 2025. And I think, in my view, Europe has dropped the ball. It's really in a mess, facing political, diplomatic humiliation, as far as I'm concerned. And that's a function of not taking the war in Ukraine seriously. Not seriously enough. Right? I'm mindful of Jack Watling at the Royal United Services Institute talking about the number of artillery shells that Ukraine needs to every year to be able to sustain its current firing rate, and it was something like 2.2 million shells every year, and the United States was providing about 1.2, and the EU was committing to another 1.2, and it was only in May this year that we could get to 800,000 or 1 million or something. The question then becomes, if the United States chooses to stop providing ammunition to Ukraine, who's going to come up with the other 1.2 million? And that's before European NATO has restocked its own arsenal with all the munitions that it's given away to Ukraine. So it's been very short-sighted and hoping that things will go away. And I think that narrative right at the get-go has sort of lulled us into a false sense of security.
Well, yeah, you just mentioned the false sense of security that we have out of the interpretations of what's going on in Ukraine. And in the book, you mentioned how we have a lot of people have a misconception about the roles of drones, for example. That was a big part of that. I remember about how a lot of people were saying, oh, drones going to be the key to the battlefield. And, Russia is using this sort of human wave tactics, and a lot of misconception about both at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. I just want to ask, as these information misconception and misperception happens, and you mentioned the tussle between analysts and lay voices, armchair historians and armchair strategists you mentioned. How do future leaders, the future generations, gonna walk out of this war, and the perception living back? How do you see it affect the future? Because my generation, we're going on Twitter, we're going on X, going on Reddit every day, watching all of these and thinking, oh, Russia's weak. Oh, Ukraine can do this with drones. The future is drone. And later on, as we grow up and we fill in these sort of leading positions in society, how dangerous would it be to have these wrong perceptions?
So I think the challenge is to have enough of a toolkit to work your way around the social media environment to be able to make sense of what it's leaving out, what are its limitations, and that's really, really important because it's good. It's good media in that it attracts your attention, and you can be distracted by it. But in terms of analytical tools, you need a whole suite of analytical tools on top of that in order to try and give yourself a sense of the implications, the meaning implications, to do the assessment of it. And I think probably people are too quick to read the media uncritically. I said earlier, broadcast is not happening live. You can see it's not happening live because someone's edited music in, or they've edited an insignia in, or there's something else going on, which is pretty clearly indicates that it might be a 12, 24, 48 hour gap between initial taking the footage and then it being broadcast. And now, if you constantly and regularly engage with that recognition, you're thinking about the provenance of the imagery, you start to think, well, what's the purpose behind its broadcast beyond the fact that it's saying, with a caption, this is a Russian human waves, or a drone takes out a tank again, or how do you contextualize that properly? And that means reflecting on all of the things that aren't actually in social media. How many drones to get shot down every month? And why are we seeing this footage? Well, that's the footage of the drone that successfully came, had something happen. But there's, 9,000 other drones where that doesn't happen, right? And of course, that collection shapes what you see. And, that's a sort of collection basis, but there's an algorithmic intervention somewhere. We're seeing this image from this particular influencer and this particular account, but not this image from another. And so the social media environment itself starts to contextualize, and that's all individual and unique to you and your particular, how you engage and interact with that platform, none of which makes it a good basis for making sound policy choices. But I don't see many people putting that simple point across. Right, which is another reason why I wrote War on the Smart. We need to talk about that a little bit, because then you're not in a position where you just uncritically take as given the footage and the imagery that you're seeing. And my solution to that was to think about things in terms of the intelligence cycle and the different sources of intelligence, and then to work with some really smart people who are doing open source intelligence, and learn how they go about doing things. And I was lucky enough to be involved in an experiment where I learned a huge amount from the analysts I was working with. We did that experiment on behalf of the UK government, and it resulted in 3 days of workshops with a bunch of UK officials, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but really, really good fun. And I learned a load about it. Now, that's not going to help people like yourselves who are having to make quick calculations, or policy people who are going to, they are not the intelligent customer necessarily, but you kind of need intelligent customers, and that starts with being intelligent consumers, it seems to me.
Great. On the topic of OSINT, open source intelligence, so sort of popular lore has it that the first Bush administration learned of the fall of the Berlin Wall through CNN, right? That's the popular image of that event. Of course, now if we take our smartphones sort of as like mini CNNs, we all carry mini CNNs in our pocket, so to speak. What do you think the relationship is between government intelligence agencies, open source intelligence, and how they see maybe the usefulness, or perhaps it'll be like detrimental to them in the future? How do you see that dynamic between government intelligence and OSINT?
So, I think it's fair to say that uh, policymakers can go on social media at any point in the day, and they can get a kind of very quick, crikey, this has happened. That prompts a question to their outer office. What's going on here? How do we respond to this? And the outer office is sitting there going, well, why is this relevant? We were doing something else policy related, but now we've got to deal with this awkward question from our boss who's telling us that on social media they spotted this. And the intelligence organizations are going through their process of their regular cycle of collecting as a routine and producing assessments as a routine. And they, at the moment, at the flip of a coin, they have to switch out and come up with an assessment on a particular thing that they're not really geared towards, but it's a hot topic in the outer office of the politician or the policymaker. And in that respect, the policymaker goes, but look, the answer is being provided by this social media, this open source intelligence company that have got all of these analysts, and they can give me an answer instantly. I don't have to wait a week for an analyst team in one of the agencies to come up with a carefully considered answer to the question. I want to know now. And of course, the intelligence community, the IC, are saying, well, hold on, we have to contextualize what you're seeing against all these other different sources. Was that footage being taken at the point where it actually happened? There's a huge amount of considerations to take into account so that you might formulate policy on the basis of something where there was an evidence base that was reasoned and thought through. Meanwhile, the outer office of the politician or the policymaker is sitting there going, well, okay, well, we need to square this away really quickly because this is getting in the way of doing our real work, right? Now, in that mix, it seems to me, is the sort of challenge facing the established intelligence community and this private open source intelligence community who are saying, look, we can deliver everything you can do, but without any of the overhead and without any of the additional expense or any of that stuff. We can give you the same answer. The intelligence community, after a week of assessment, may come up with the same answer as the private sector organization or the individuals who are online, right? That's where it seems to me the challenge comes. But the more the IC gets outsourced and privatized, the less in-house expertise there is. And for me, at least, it's about holding on to that in-house expertise, knowing how to do it the long route, the long-handed way, not just with the clever, I've scraped every different type of open source I can, combined it with some Gucci algorithm and, here's your answer. But, understanding the long-handed way of doing it is really important because it builds resilience, it builds thoughtful analysts, and those analysts can come to conclusions that are much more considered. And sometimes time, in terms of having considered responses, is more important than, instant knee-jerk responses. You can bounce from one knee-jerk challenge to another, and actually, if you slow down a little bit, you can produce something more sensible. And let's face it, government doesn't always move at the speed of data. And sometimes you don't need government to work at the speed of data. You can't acquire a new armored fighting vehicle in a moment. So you need to reflect that whatever intelligence collection effort and analysis you do, it needs to be cycled into that it needs to put into the life cycle of that development process, not just sort of, well, drones are the next thing, so we're going to abandon the Abrams. Well, maybe. I mean, I don't have all the data that US analysts have. But I'd like to think that a more considered calculation is being made in relation to future kit or future warfare than whatever is being said on X at any one moment.
Dr. Ford, thank you again for being with us to discuss your upcoming book, War in the Smartphone Age, Conflict, Connectivity, and the Crises at Our Fingertips. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. Please be sure to check out a copy of Dr. Ford's book. And please be sure to tune in to the next episode of the GNSI video series.